We all have our guilty pleasures when it comes to TV shows, don't we? I watched a show a few years ago that would definitely fall into that category of guilty pleasures TV. A show that was on the National Geographic channel, no less. So I guess that just goes to show you how lowbrow some of our entertainment has actually become. The show was called Doomsday Preppers. Now, maybe some of you have heard of it, and if you haven't, believe me, you're not really missing too much. But for me, it was indeed a guilty pleasure, and thanks to having a DVR, I saw every single episode of its 2-year run. And when it was over, I actually found myself lamenting its passing. Now, why? Well, I thought the show was just absolutely hysterical. I mean, that's what it really is. You know, every time I'd watch an episode, I'd just be sitting on the couch there just dying of laughter. And my poor wife, she would just be looking over at me, rolling her eyes like, "You're crazy." And I guess if I take a show about doomsday and the end of the world as being a comedy, I guess maybe she probably had a point. But every episode, it featured these survivalists or doomsday preppers who were feverishly preparing for circumstances that would bring about the end of civilization as we know it. You know, the show, I mean, it got started just after the Great Recession, as they called it, had ended. So a lot of people had real fears back then. You know, some people felt that the world was going to come to an end because of an economic collapse. Some thought it would be because of a nuclear war or some kind of EMP that would just knock out our technology grid. And others thought that it would be some kind of deadly outbreak. So it would chronicle their plans to outlive and outlast any kind of apocalyptic scenario. So the people would stockpile things like food and water and weapons and whatever they thought was necessary to have should things fall apart. So doomsday prepping, this was and is a real subculture. And I couldn't help it. The sheer paranoia of some of these people is what actually made the show so funny to me. I mean, imagine that you've got this really nice gated mansion on this beautiful wooded property, and you build a guard tower right in the middle of it, you know, for when the marauders are going to come after you. Or imagine family bonding by building your very own doomsday castle. Yes, that's a thing. Or, and this one just cracks me up, or imagine bringing a pretty girl on your first date together to an old abandoned missile silo that you purchased for $3 million and converted into a doomsday shelter. Now that was the kind of hilarity that you could just count on week after week on Nat Geo. But as stupid as all of that was, like I said, you know, a lot of people were genuinely freaked out. There was the Great Recession. The big Ebola scare occurred during the show's run. And then, of course, you've always got your apocalyptic date setters. I mean, who can forget the infamous date of December 21st, 2012? That's the supposed date when the Mayan calendar ended, and which, of course, was supposed to usher in Armageddon. And that one is funny because we'd actually gone to Mexico when all of that stuff was at a fever pitch, and we toured these Mayan ruins, and someone on the tour asked our genuine Mayan historian tour guide about all the 2012 stuff, and I'll never forget his response. He just shook his head in disgust, and he said, "Yeah, well, some people think that all these pyramids and the great Mayan cities were also built by space aliens." So that about sums it up. And then you've got to love our own Bible prophecy scholars who seem to know more than Jesus does about when the end is going to come. The infamous Harold Camping had said that the world was going to end a year earlier on May 21st, 2011. And I remember that one too because Judgment Day actually fell on a Saturday. And that was when my wife and we went to the Saturday evening worship service at the church that we were members at the time. And so the pastor, he came out on the stage and he looks around at everybody with a smile and he says, "Well, I guess we're all still here, so I guess this isn't the end of the world yet." There's been so many examples of this just in my lifetime. These are just the recent ones, so it seems like everybody wants to be some kind of Nostradamus. But for a nation that has more wealth and comfort than anywhere else in the civilized world, we sure do seem to think that the end is nigh, don't we? So it's no wonder then that a show like Doomsday Preppers would actually be so popular. But then again, if we get past the hysterics, maybe there's a grain of truth to all of this. All of us at some point have to face the sobering reminder that nothing lasts forever. There are plenty of real world crises that can bring our world to an end, both literally or figuratively. And so we should be prepared. That's certainly what's going on with our text today. We're not Nostradamus, but we can't deny that such crises do exist. For decades, real scholars have referred to this section in Mark that we read today as the little apocalypse. So we already sort of know the context here. This is right after that people watching episode and the old lady putting in the coin. And so I imagine that this scene, when it starts, the sun is setting as they're leaving the temple. They're walking the grounds, and the disciples are just captivated by the beauty of the temple. The white marble stones on the outside, they were adorned with gold, and they would have been shining brilliantly in the light of the setting sun. But more than that, more than just the aesthetics, they were standing in a place where God supposedly made his earthly home. So it's no wonder that they would have been commenting on the grandeur of that holy place. It must have been totally breathtaking, which is why Jesus' statement would have been utterly shocking. No stone will be left unturned. And not only was this statement shocking, it was actually dangerous. It was subversive. You know, the temple was the center of Jewish life, and even though they were seen as being this endless annoyance, the Romans also had a stake in the temple life. So saying that it was going to be torn down and destroyed, it would have been just unthinkable. So naturally, the disciples, they're all freaked out. So he takes them up to the Mount of Olives. And the thing is about this, that setting would have made this whole conversation all the more eerie and frightening. And I say that because that mountain, well, it was directly opposite the temple. So they would have been facing the temple as they were talking. They would have had these breathtaking views of the entire temple complex there in the setting sun. And here's Jesus talking about the whole thing going to be destroyed. So why? Why is he doing this? Well, regardless of when this gospel was written, his words were actually anticipating a time when the false messiahs and the false prophets would come onto the scene, and they were going to be just running around by the dozens, inciting the Jewish people to join what would ultimately be a doomed rebellion against Rome. So his words were anticipating a time when Roman legions would literally descend upon Jerusalem and slaughter her people by the thousands. He's talking to them about being prepared to face their own very real apocalypse. And he's warning them not to get sucked in by any of these people that claim to have all the answers. No stone will be left unturned. You know, these are harsh, sobering words that warn us about being prepared. One of my favorite theologians, the great Paul Tillich, he had escaped Germany and the Nazis by coming to America during World War II. And after the war was over, after reflecting on the devastation of his homeland and the horrors of the Holocaust and the dropping of the atomic bomb, he wrote an important sermon called The Shaking of the Foundations. Now, when we consider things like war and conflict, I think every Christian on this planet should read that sermon. Because in it, Paul Tillich, he makes the point that God had laid the foundations for the earth, but humankind had discovered its undoing. In the 20th century, we had this seemingly limitless hope and faith in science and technology and progress. And he says of all these things, I'm quoting him, he said, "We cried progress, infinite progress, peace, universal peace, happiness, happiness for everyone." That same science and the saving power of which these false prophets believed has utterly destroyed that idolatry. The greatest triumph of science was the power it gave to man to annihilate himself and his world. Wow. And then he asks the questions. What will we do with this terrible ability? Will we destroy the very foundations of the earth? And so here we are, 73 years later after he preached that sermon, and we still live in the shadows of these haunting questions. Nation will rise against nation, Jesus says. So maybe there is good reason to be prepared. And let's face it, Houses and buildings aren't supposed to crumble to the ground. Oceans aren't supposed to leap out of the sea and flood miles and miles inland. And fires aren't supposed to spread and destroy everything in their path. And the sky isn't supposed to form a funnel cloud that can level entire towns. But we see it all too often. And some of you have probably actually lived through these things, or you know someone that has. The shaking of the foundations and no stone left unturned. Sadly, these things can happen to us at any time. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be wars or rumors of wars that shake our foundations. It doesn't have to be hurricanes and other natural disasters. It could be something as simple as a visit to the doctor. It could be discovering a text message that confirms your worst fears. It could be a phone call from the police or a hospital in the middle of the night. These little apocalypses in our own lives, they're never that far off. This is scary stuff, isn't it? Right now, in my own life, here I am, facing things that I never wanted to face. Sure, you might say that it's inevitable, but nonetheless, all of it seemed vague and distant for so long. They were just things that you kick down the road and you try never to actually think about it for the sake of your own sanity. And yet, here I am. The great poet Yeats, he accurately described these little apocalypses in our lives in his poem that was ironically titled The Second Coming. And he says this: turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Our veil of innocence is so easily shattered. This is scary and heavy stuff. Our anchors in life they aren't as stable as we think they are. Sometimes all it takes is one thing for the rug to just be pulled out from under us. And just in the short time that I've been a pastor, on several occasions where I've visited with people who are suffering from serious illnesses or life-threatening kinds of situations, I've been told that the things that they used to place so much emphasis on suddenly don't really matter that much anymore. All of our things don't give us more time with the ones we love, and all of our things can't prevent something like cancer. So should we become doomsday preppers? Do we actually need to start preparing for these little apocalypses? What would you do if you found out you only had 1 month to live? My God, that's terrifying. One commentary I read while researching for this sermon, it summed all of these things up perfectly when it said, by answering yes to one or more of these possibilities, we indicate that in our last days, we would be better stewards of all the things that God has given us in this life, better than we are now. In the intensity of the last days, we would live better. We would be better. We would be more generous and more focused on the important things in life. And so the question is, why do we need to be under the threat of death to be better stewards? I think this sentiment gets to the very heart of what Jesus is trying to say here. Jesus wants us to see with the intensity of the last day and these little apocalypses while living our ordinary daily lives. Be mindful. Be watchful. See, here's the deal. What Jesus is saying to them, and by extension to all of us, is these things that shake our foundations, whether it's a crisis out in the world or right here at home, these aren't signs of the end. Jesus doesn't want us to be looking at the Bible like we're some kind of Nostradamus. No, he wants to point us past all of that and to God's promises for us. He wants us to move from a place of worry to a place of hope. The end will come, and it will be a glorious thing. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again in glory. Things may seem to have fallen apart, but the center will hold because it's a nail-pierced hand that is holding up this world. And he's promised to redeem and to restore all things. No bomb shelters, no guard towers. Hope, my brothers and sisters. That is our foundation, not these stones that fall around us. And more than that, our God promises us that through his love, we will have the strength to endure all things. You know, as St. Paul himself said, we are pressed on all sides, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house made not with hands, eternal in the heavens. So we are always of good courage. So in Christ, let us be truly prepared. Let us take hold of these promises and claim them for ourselves to weather these little apocalypses, whatever they may be. And if some of the things I've said seem scary and are unsettling to you, I understand. It's not your friendly text for Thanksgiving, is it? But this is the lectionary. But I want you to take heart. You may have heard these promises and these assurances 1,000 times, and you may believe them in a sense, but in another sense, they kind of just, go in one ear and out the other. But in my own experience over these past couple of years, as I face things that I never wanted to face, I have found that they are indeed true. God has given me a strength that I never knew I had, and he'll do it for you too, when you need it. I've seen it both in myself and I've seen it in the sick and in the dying people that I've ministered to, with Jesus and his love surrounding us and holding us up. We can face any apocalypse. So let me leave you with a story. It's actually one of my favorites in the entire Bible. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah was faced with a little apocalypse of his own. He had offended Jezebel, and she was aggressively trying to have him killed. So he had to flee for his life, and he was filled with such terror and despair that he asked God to just kill him and just be done with it. And when that didn't happen, he hid in a cave, and he was determined to just waste away there. But then God promised him a sign in the midst of his apocalypse. He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before Yahweh." And then there came a great wind that was so strong that it split the mountains and it broke the rocks in pieces. But the scriptures record the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind came, there was an earthquake. But again, the scripture says Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there came a sound of sheer silence. It was in that silence that a still small voice came to Elijah. And he heard that voice. He heard that voice through all of it. In our lives, there will be things that shake our foundation and leave no stone unturned. But God is not in those things. No, God is inside each and every one of you. And he's bringing you the hope and the strength of his still small voice when you need it the most, reminding you that there's good news even at the end of the world. He will prepare us. Thanks be to God. Amen.